What I'm about to show you may change the way you look at every blood pressure reading you've ever taken. Because the number quietly raising risk for many seniors is often not just the top number, it's the gap between the top and bottom numbers. And when I reveal number one, the widest pulse pressure on this list, you're going to understand why some readings look almost harmless at first glance, while actually signaling a pattern that deserves much more attention. Right now, somewhere, a senior is looking at a reading like 150 over 80 and thinking, well, maybe that's a little high, but it doesn't seem extreme. And somewhere else, another person is seeing 160 over 70 and focusing only on the top number, never realizing the distance between those two numbers may be telling an even bigger story. Here's what almost no one talks about. Pulse pressure is often the quiet clue. It can reflect how stiff the arteries have become, how much strain the system may be under, and why risk can rise even when the bottom number doesn't look alarming. Pulse pressure is simply the top number minus the bottom number, and a normal value is around 40. As people get older, arteries often become stiffer, systolic pressure tends to rise, diastolic pressure may drift down, and that gap can widen. Cleveland Clinic National Institute on Aging NCBI bookshelf. By the end of this video, you'll know the 5 pulse pressure numbers that deserve the closest attention, why number 1 is the most concerning of all, and why this is not about panic, it's about pattern recognition, purely educational, purely informational, and simple enough to understand in real life. And please subscribe for more simple educational videos that help you protect your daily wellness journey with clarity, not confusion. Let me start with number 5 because this is where the quiet shift often begins. Number 5 is a pulse pressure of 50. Let me tell you about Carol. Carol was 69, active, organized, and proud of how carefully she tracked her readings. One morning, she saw 130 over 80. Nothing shocking. Another day, 128 over 78. Then, 132 over 82. She felt reassured because none of those top numbers looked dramatic. But here's what she never calculated. Her pulse pressure was hovering around 50. Now, 50 is not the kind of number that automatically means danger. And that's exactly why it gets overlooked. It doesn't scream, it whispers. If normal pulse pressure is around 40, then 50 is often the first quiet move away from that baseline. Not necessarily a crisis, not necessarily a diagnosis, but a gentle widening that says pay attention to the trend, not just the headline number. Cleveland Clinic NCBI bookshelf. And here's why that matters. In younger, more flexible arteries, the system absorbs the force of each heartbeat more easily, but with age, arteries often lose that flexibility. The top number rises more, the bottom number may not rise with it, and the gap starts to widen. So when pulse pressure reaches 50 repeatedly, it may be the beginning of a pattern rather than a random fluke. That's what makes it so easy to dismiss and so important not to ignore. National Institute on Aging NCBI bookshelf. But if 50 is the quiet beginning, number 4 is where the research starts getting much more serious. Number 4 is 60. Let me tell you about Leonard. Leonard was 74, and his reading looked like this over and over again. 142 over 82, 144 over 84, 146 over 86. He kept looking at the bottom number and thinking, well, that second number isn't too bad. But the gap was 60. And 60 is the point where pulse pressure stops being merely interesting and starts being a recognized risk marker in older adults. Mayo Clinic notes that a pulse pressure greater than 60 is a risk factor for heart disease, especially in older adults. And in one large study of adults in primary care, elevated pulse pressure was defined as 60 or more, with the paper describing it as an independent marker of cardiovascular risk in people older than 60. That's a big shift, because now we're no longer talking about a slight move away from ideal. We're talking about a threshold that research has specifically singled out. Mayo Clinic PMC, and this is where many seniors encounter the most common misunderstanding of all. They think the bottom number matters less if it isn't high. But a falling or relatively lower diastolic number combined with a rising systolic number can create exactly the kind of widened gap that reflects arterial stiffening. In other words, the reading can look calmer than the physiology actually is. That's what makes 60 so deceptive. National Institute on Aging NCBI bookshelf. But number three is where the gap gets harder to explain away. Number three is 70. Let me tell you about Elaine. Elaine was 76, and her reading one afternoon was 150 over 80. The next day, 148 over 78, then 152 over 82. Every time, her pulse pressure was right around 70. And here's what made that so tricky. She didn't feel terrible. She wasn't in some dramatic emergency. Life still felt mostly normal, which is exactly why this number can quietly sit there for months, even years, without getting the attention it deserves. A pulse pressure of 70 means the gap between systolic and diastolic pressure is no longer mildly widened. It's meaningfully widened. And in older adults, that matters. In a long-term community study of people aged 65 and older, every 10 millimeters of mercury increase in pulse pressure was associated with a 12% increase in coronary heart disease risk and a 14% increase in heart failure risk. Think about that for a second. If the normal zone is around 40, moving from 40 to 70 is not a tiny change. That is 3 10-point jumps. That's why a number like 70 deserves respect even when it arrives quietly. PubMed NCBI bookshelf. And here's what almost no one talks about. A pulse pressure of 70 often fools people because the top number may look borderline rather than outrageous. But pulse pressure is about the relationship between the two numbers, not just one in isolation. That relationship is often the hidden story. That relationship is where stiffness, pressure waves, and vascular aging begin showing themselves much more clearly. NCBI bookshelf. Now we move to number two, and this is where the signal becomes much louder. Number two is 80. Let me tell you about Frank. Frank was 79. His readings started showing a pattern like 158 over 78, then 160 over 80, then 156 over 76. Every time the pulse pressure was around 80. He kept focusing on the fact that he had seen worse numbers in other people, but that was the wrong comparison, because pulse pressure is not about comparing your top number to someone else's top number. It's about what your own widening gap may be revealing. A clinical review on wide pulse pressure reported that the risk for composite cardiovascular events begins to rise significantly when pulse pressure goes above 80. That matters because 80 is not just a bigger number. It's the kind of gap that suggests the force wave moving through the arteries is becoming increasingly uneven and increasingly difficult for the vascular system to buffer. Wide pulse pressure has also been described in that review as an independent predictor of disease progression and all-cause mortality, PMC review. And this is where heart attack risk enters the conversation more quietly than most people realize. The same review noted that each 10 millimeters of mercury increase in pulse pressure was associated with a 23% increased risk of developing coronary heart disease in Framingham data. That doesn't mean one reading of 80 predicts one outcome. It means the pattern of widening matters. It means the trend matters. It means the gap itself can carry meaningful information about cardiovascular risk, especially in older adults. PMC review. But number one is the one I really need you to understand, because this is the reading range that looks strange, sounds dramatic, and yet still gets misunderstood every single day. Number one is 90 and beyond. Let me tell you about Gloria. Gloria's readings looked like this: 162 over 72, then 166 over 74, then 170 over 76. She kept saying the same thing. My bottom number isn't that high, so maybe this isn't as bad as it seems. But that was exactly the trap. Her pulse pressure was in the 90s. And once you get into that territory, you're moving toward what one clinical review describes as very wide pulse pressure, with values above 100 millimeters of mercury formally classified as widened in that paper. Now, let's be careful here. A pulse pressure in the 90s or higher is not a diagnosis by itself. It does not explain the cause by itself, but it is the kind of number that should never be brushed aside as meaningless, because by the time the gap is that large, the difference between the force of contraction and the resting arterial pressure has become extreme enough that the reading may reflect advanced arterial stiffness or other significant cardiovascular issues that deserve proper context. And when that gap reaches 100 or more, the review describes it as wide pulse pressure territory, often seen in the setting of substantial cardiovascular disease. PMC review. Here's what makes this so important for seniors. In older adults, pulse pressure may actually predict risk better than some of the traditional blood pressure measures taken alone. In a study of more than 9,000 older adults, pulse pressure was described as a slightly stronger predictor of cardiovascular and total mortality than systolic or diastolic pressure alone. That means a very wide gap is not some side note. It may be one of the most meaningful parts of the reading. PubMed. But here's the part that brings everything together. These 5 numbers are not 5 separate worlds. They're a progression. 50 is the quiet drift away from ideal. 60 is where research clearly starts paying attention. 70 is where the widening becomes harder to dismiss. 80 is where risk rises more sharply. And the 90s and beyond, especially if a reading approaches or crosses 100, belong to the category no one should treat casually. And yet, there is one more thing you need to understand before we finish. Pulse pressure is useful only when the reading itself is trustworthy. If the cuff is wrong, if the timing is random, if the conditions are inconsistent, then the gap may look wider or narrower than it really is. That's why the real power comes from repeated readings taken under similar conditions, not from one dramatic number taken in the middle of a stressful day. A pattern is what matters most. So, what does a smart, calm approach look like? It looks like noticing the gap instead of ignoring it. It looks like recording not just the full blood pressure reading, but the difference between the top and bottom numbers. It looks like comparing your own trend over time rather than obsessing over a single isolated result. And it looks like understanding that pulse pressure is not there to scare you. It's there to tell a deeper story that the usual quick glance may miss. Let me leave you with Harold because his story brings this home. Harold was 77. He had been writing down only the top and bottom numbers for years, never once subtracting them. One day his log showed 154 over 84. Another day, 156 over 82. Another day, 160 over 80. He thought he was looking at random variation. He wasn't. He was looking at pulse pressures of 70, 74, and 80. A pattern, a quiet, steady widening. The numbers had been speaking the whole time. He just hadn't been listening to the right part. That's what this video is really about. Not fear, awareness, not guessing, understanding, not staring only at the big top number while the hidden gap quietly tells the bigger story. Now, you know the 5 pulse pressure numbers that deserve attention: 50, 60, 70, 80, and 90 and beyond. You know why pulse pressure matters more with age. You know why widening often reflects changes in the arteries themselves. And you know why the most overlooked number in your blood pressure reading may be the distance between the two numbers, not just the numbers alone. Cleveland Clinic, Mayo Clinic, National Institute on Aging. If this video helped you see your readings in a completely different way, subscribe to the channel. And share this with any senior, family member, or friend who checks blood pressure at home, because sometimes the most important warning sign is not the number everyone talks about. It's the number almost everyone forgets to calculate. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next video.